Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about terrorism, and I have to say that this topic is quite linked with the one we saw on war and conflict. Why? Well, because of one simple characteristic fear. If you remember, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he used a very famous phrase. He said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And how is fear a great component or the most important component when it comes to the word terrorism? Well, first of all, we should think about the definition for terrorism. And I have to tell you that there is neither an academic definition nor an international consensus over what is terrorism or how to define it. Even the United Nations has no internationally agreed definition of terrorism. And first, you need to think of why is there no consensus over the definition? And this is a question that I might be asking you further on. And why is this? Well, first of all, even if the UN has the ability to develop a very comprehensive strategy, the inability to create a definition, it depends on the states. Why? Because they believe that there can be like issues regarding how the states sometimes use the armed forces against civilians. And this is very related to the concept of civil war, but it's also considered state-sponsored terrorism or state terrorism. So when member states in the United Nations are not able to really come into a consensus, then the United Nations cannot have a simple definition or a unique definition for terrorism. Another objection to having a single definition is that, well, what would happen if there is a population under foreign occupation and they have the right to resistance, right? So when they defend themselves against this foreign invasion, it might also be considered terrorism. But, well, it might also be considered part of a civil war or maybe an ethnic conflict or a religious conflict. So it's also part of what people do when they defend themselves. So this is why it's been so difficult to have a legal definition, even in international law. So what about the General Assembly? There is a declaration on measures to eliminate international terrorism, but if we analyze this quote right here, it would say that criminal acts that are intended or calculated, in other words, premeditated, to create or to provoke a state of terror in the general public or group of persons, or particular group of persons. It doesn't matter if you have considerations of political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any other nature. You don't have a way to justify those criminal acts. So that's the thing that for sure they decided that, well, this is something that we all agree on, right? Criminal acts, whatever the purposes they may have, whatever the considerations they may have, they are just unjustifiable. So, well, if you look in the academic world, you might find some very simple definitions. For example, Goldstein and Peathouse, they said that terrorism is a political violence that targets civilians deliberately and indiscriminately. So, the target is for civilians, and they also speak about political violence. So you're talking about maybe a group of people that disagrees with the government, right? In a second definition, Mingst, he defines it as a particular kind of asymmetric warfare that has increasingly become a major international security threat. Why is it asymmetric? Well, because it's done in secret. That is why it's called like terrorism. You create fear, but you don't really know what the targets are, when it's going to happen, and how is it going to happen. If we look at this map, guys, you will see that the countries that are in red are of extreme risk. And of course, you can see here part of the Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, which we'll be analyzing in the course. And for example, Nigeria, where Boko Haram is located, or Somalia, where you have Al-Shabaab. And of course, all the portions of land that in which Islamic State has been, extending. And then you can see some other countries that have, high risk or at least medium risk. So you can see that in the American continent, there is like from medium to low risk. But when it comes to the northern part of Africa in part of the sub-Saharan Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. Well, these are places where extreme risk for terrorism is present in every day. So what are the traditional purposes of terrorism? Well, first of all, you need to demoralize civilian population in order to use the discontent that they have, the fear that they talk about as a leverage to negotiate with national governments or other parties to a conflict. When people start to feel fear, they start to pressure the government to pay attention to those issues. And that is how the terrorist organizations operate. They try to demoralize people so that they provoke this pressure, like I said before. And they also, create drama in order to gain media. And as you remember, media is one of the most important international actors. Once you capture the attention of the media, then you have all the eyes on you. And of course, you generate fear. So if you have been looking and seeing on YouTube and other media information channels, for example, Islamic State has created all of these three purposes into one by creating these videos in which they show extreme violence when it comes to the people that they have kidnapped. Well, there is like another kind of elements that terrorism might have is the objective elements and the subjective elements, right? When it comes to the objective elements, you're talking about criminal offenses, mainly the use of physical violence against people, or when you create serious damage to public property, including infrastructure facilities. So in other words, it's like making real damage, a tangible damage. And the subjective element, well, this refers to the intention to create a climate of terror and fear within the population, or even if you have the intention to coerce in different degrees or to pressure a government or international organizations, well, at the end, what you want is to generate this fear, and that is what you can define as an element for subjectiveness. What are the four major elements if we are able to summarize them? Well, first of all, terrorism involves premeditation. What does this mean? That it will take the decision of a perpetrator to commit an act or instill terror or fear in others. So there is a planning and decisions that are taken to deliberate some actions. Of course, you are going to have a motivation or a cause. It can be political, it can be religious, it can be even economic. And of course, you are going to have targets, right? It doesn't matter if they are combatants or civilians. For example, political figures, bureaucrats, or even innocent bystanders, right? So this is like the hardest part, the targets and the innocents that are taken, the lives that are taken by the means of terrorism. And at the end, well, you incorporate a major element as secretiveness, which means that you will carry out clandestine actions, or you are secretly sponsored by states or other organizations. So secretiveness is also a key element. What are the two types of terrorism? Well, first of all, you have state terrorism, like its name says. Well, this is going to be carried out by the state, which means a country, a government. Then you have a non-state terrorism, which pretty much every international organized crime organization or terrorist organization will be part of this category. And at the end, you have state-sponsored terrorism, which means that there is a state that is perhaps secretively financing the terrorist actions of a terrorist group. If you talk about state terrorism, like I said, the state is going to use terrorism to suppress the citizens, right? And if we go way back to 1794 in the Reign of Terror, the French Revolution, you see some examples of how it was done in those years. If you remember Robespierre and the guillotine in Marie Antoinette and Lavoisier, and this was done by the state, right? Then you have Stalin back in the 1930s, where he created the Great Purge, in which he eliminated 500,000 people because he considered them to be their opponents. So some of them were killed, some others were sent to gulags. And of course, we have a question here, right? In our country, could you really say that what happened in Ayotzinapa or what is happening in Michoacán could be an example of state terrorism? Let's think about it. In non-state terrorism, it means that this is created by people that are not part of the state. They have very clear political goals. They use violence against civilians that are attacked by surprise. And of course, the main ingredient here is financed by particulars. So examples such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the Islamic State in the Middle East, basically Iraq and Syria, mainly Boko Haram in Nigeria. You have Hamas and Hezbollah in the Israel and in Lebanon, and you have Al Qaeda in parts of the Middle East. And well, in the 90s there was a terrorist organization in Ireland, and of course the FARC in Colombia. What about state-sponsored terrorism? Well, this means that governments are providing supplies or maybe training or any other forms of support to non-state organizations. And probably we can go way back to, I don't know, Operation Condor, which was conducted by the CIA in the 70s. So maybe the coup d'etat that was performed in Chile by in order to tackle down the government of, I forgot the name. Well, Pinochet, in order to tackle down the communist regime of, I owe you that. Okay, and then we have Gaddafi in Salvador Allende. I remember, sorry. Salvador Allende, a communist government, was tackled down by Pinochet in a coup d'etat in Chile. And of course, it is said that it was sponsored by the CIA. So how come you have a government that is trying to exercise power in another country that is not theirs, but, well, you're sponsoring someone because you didn't like the communists back in those days. You have Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, well, and Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And perhaps we could also think about Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, right? Now that he is trying to gain more control of territory in that place. So this is basically the main information on terrorism. I'll be telling you what you are going to do as an activity. Thank you, guys.